A small island, 90 miles from Florida. It outlasted 11 American presidents. It survived an invasion organized by the CIA. It once had nuclear missiles aimed at New York, and for more than 60 years, it defied the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Today, blackouts lasting 20 hours a day, 1 million people without access to water, an economy on the edge of total collapse. How is this possible? How did a small, poor, communist country survive 60 years of embargo, dozens of attempts to overthrow its government, and a fuel blockade that is quite literally turning off the lights across the entire country? This isn't just a modern energy crisis. It's the final chapter of a standoff that started 70 years ago in a country that was once a playground for American businessmen, gangsters, and politicians, until one man decided to change everything. At the beginning of the 20th century, Cuba was formally independent, but only formally. In practice, it was an American colony in everything but name. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States took control of the island. Not officially, but in every way that mattered. American companies owned most of Cuba's sugar mills, mines, and plantations. American banks controlled the Cuban economy, and the American government decided who was allowed to rule in Havana. Fulgencio Batista was the perfect partner for Washington, a dictator who seized power in 1952 through a military coup, corruption at every level of government, a political police force that tortured and murdered opponents. And all the while, Havana flourished as the capital of gambling and entertainment for wealthy Americans. Hotels and casinos were controlled by the American mafia. Havana became the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. For the wealthy, paradise. For most Cubans, humiliation. Peasants worked on plantations owned by foreigners. Workers lived in poverty while Americans celebrated in luxury hotels. Illiteracy was widespread. Healthcare was out of reach for most of the population. And it was in this environment that Fidel Castro emerged. A lawyer from the upper middle class, a charismatic speaker, a man who saw the hypocrisy of the system and decided to overthrow it. In 1953, he led an attack on the Moncada barracks. The attack failed. He was sent to prison. But his speech at trial, ending with the words, "History will absolve me," turned him into a symbol of resistance. He was released from prison. He went into exile in Mexico, and he began planning a revolution. January the 1st, 1959. Batista fled Cuba. He boarded a plane in the middle of the night and disappeared, taking hundreds of millions of dollars from the state treasury with him. Castro entered Havana. Crowds welcomed him as a hero. The revolution had won. Washington watched with unease, but didn't panic. They believed Castro was just another Latin American nationalist they could do business with, that he would fall in line, that commerce would continue as usual. They were wrong. Castro moved fast. He nationalized sugar mills, oil refineries, hotels, and banks. Most of them were American-owned, without compensation. Washington's patience began to run out. The CIA launched its first attempts to overthrow Castro. Economic sanctions followed, an embargo on Cuban sugar imports, diplomatic pressure. Castro responded by turning to Moscow. That decision changed everything. The Soviet Union saw Cuba as the perfect opportunity, a communist country 90 miles from the coast of Florida, right in the heart of America's sphere of influence. Khrushchev sent weapons, advisors, and oil. Castro gained the protection of the world's most powerful communist state. But was Castro a communist from the very beginning? That's a question historians still debate today. Castro himself claimed different things at different times. One thing is certain: the harder the United States attacked him, the closer he moved toward Moscow. America's hostility helped turn Cuba into a communist country. And just as relations between Washington and Havana reached a breaking point, the CIA decided to act. It was April of 1961. On April the 17th, 1,400 soldiers landed on the Cuban coast, Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA. The plan was simple: overthrow Castro, restore the old order, and prove that communism in Cuba was just a passing episode. The plan was a disaster from the first minute. Castro knew about the invasion in advance. Cuban intelligence had infiltrated the CIA's networks in Florida. By the time the exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban army was already waiting for them. Kennedy, a new president barely 3 months into office, had walked straight into a trap set by his predecessor. The plan had been prepared under Eisenhower. Kennedy inherited it, and at the last moment, he grew wary of the scale of the operation and pulled the air support that was supposed to cover the invasion. Without air cover, the invasion never stood a chance. Within 72 hours, it was over. 1,118 exiles ended up in Cuban prisons. The rest were killed or escaped. Castro declared victory in front of the cameras, and he was right. The United States had just carried out an illegal invasion of a sovereign country and lost. Kennedy publicly took responsibility, but privately, he was furious at the CIA, at his military advisors, at the entire plan that had turned into a fiasco. Castro emerged from the Bay of Pigs stronger than ever, a hero who had defeated America, and Moscow took notice. If the United States was willing to attack Cuba, Cuba needed better protection, and Khrushchev knew exactly what to offer. October of 1962. An American U-2 spy plane photographed Cuba from high altitude. The photos landed on Kennedy's desk. What he saw changed the course of history. Soviet ballistic missile launchers, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, being built in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Khrushchev had done exactly what Washington feared after the Bay of Pigs. He had given Castro a weapon nobody could ignore. Missiles from Cuba could reach Washington, New York, and most of the United States within minutes, not hours, like missiles launched from Soviet territory. Minutes. Kennedy faced a decision that could have ended in nuclear war. His generals wanted an immediate strike on Cuba, destroy the launch sites before they became operational. Kennedy hesitated. He knew a strike could provoke Moscow into retaliation in Europe or directly against the United States. Instead of an attack, he chose a naval blockade. The American Navy surrounded Cuba. No ship carrying weapons was allowed through. The entire world held its breath, watching to see whether Soviet ships would turn back, or whether this would escalate into a confrontation that could spiral into nuclear war. 13 days of negotiations, bluffs, and fear that historians call humanity's closest brush with nuclear annihilation. On October the 28th, Khrushchev backed down. The Soviet ships turned around. The missiles would be removed from Cuba. In exchange, Kennedy secretly agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey and publicly promised never to invade Cuba. The world exhaled, but for Castro, it was a bitter victory. Moscow and Washington had negotiated over his head. His country's fate had been decided without him. Cuba survived, but it learned that even its strongest allies could sacrifice it when the stakes were high enough. After the missile crisis, Kennedy kept his promise. No invasion. But that didn't mean peace. The United States traded military weapons for economic ones. The embargo that had begun back in 1960 was now tightened and would last far longer than anyone expected. A ban on trade, a ban on travel, a ban on investment. Any company in the world that wanted to do business with the United States had to choose America or Cuba. Never both at once. Castro survived thanks to one ally, the Soviet Union. Moscow bought Cuban sugar at inflated prices, sent cheap oil, funded the military, hospitals, schools. For more than 25 years, Cuba lived on a Soviet lifeline. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The lifeline was cut overnight. What followed, Cubans call the special period. The economy shrank by more than a third within just a few years. No fuel, no food. People rode bicycles because there was no gasoline. They raised pigs on their balconies because store shelves stood empty. Castro survived, but barely. In 2006, Castro fell seriously ill. He transferred power to his brother Raúl, temporarily at first, then officially and permanently in 2008. Fidel lived 8 more years out of the spotlight, watching the country he had built. He died on November the 25th, 2016, at the age of 90. The man who had defied 11 American presidents, survived hundreds of assassination attempts, and ruled Cuba for nearly 50 years, passed away peacefully in his own bed. In Miami, Cuban exiles celebrated in the streets. In Havana, 9 days of national mourning were declared. Raúl continued to govern, more cautiously, more pragmatically, but still in his brother's shadow, and still within the system Fidel had built. Relief for Cuba's economy had arrived earlier, unexpectedly, at the turn of the millennium. A new ally in Latin America, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Venezuela had exactly what Cuba needed most: oil. Cuba had what Venezuela needed: doctors and political support. The arrangement was simple. Thousands of Cuban doctors were sent to Venezuela's slums. In exchange, tankers of Venezuelan oil sailed to Havana. For 2 decades, this arrangement kept the Cuban economy alive. But alliances built on a single country are fragile, and Venezuela was about to become the most unstable partner Cuba could have chosen. On January 3, 2026, American Special Forces captured Nicolas Maduro in Caracas. For Venezuela, it was the end of a dictator. For Cuba, it was the end of a lifeline. Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with oil for more than 20 years. When Maduro ended up in an American prison, that tap was shut off. The United States didn't wait. It began seizing tankers carrying Venezuelan oil bound for Cuba and declared a full blockade on those exports. For an island dependent on foreign oil for decades, it was a fatal blow. Power plants began failing one after another. On March 16, 2026, Cuba's entire national power grid collapsed completely. Less than a week later, it collapsed again. Blackouts lasting 20, sometimes 22 hours a day became routine. For 10 million Cubans, this means a nightmare. Without electricity, water pumps don't work, so there's no water. Without electricity, refrigerators don't work, so food rots. Hospitals run on emergency generators that are also running out of fuel. The United Nations warns that the blockade threatens the food security of the entire country. The government closed schools, cut back public transportation. Garbage rots in the streets of Havana because there's no fuel for the trucks. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel accuses America of financial and energy persecution. Washington responds that this is the consequence of 60 years of policy that Cuba chose for itself. Russia is sending tankers of oil, but it's a drop in an ocean of need. China is helping build solar farms, but too little, too slowly. 66 years after Castro's revolution, more than a century after gaining independence from Spain, Cuba is still fighting for something as basic as light in people's homes. A small island that survived 11 American presidents, an invasion, a nuclear crisis, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, today faces a crisis unlike anything it has seen in decades. What comes next for Cuba? Nobody knows, but the whole world is watching.